Hi everybody, and welcome to Intro to AJAX Episode 1, where we're going to focus on the server side. And this episode is going to assume a few things that you're familiar with, the concepts and acronyms that were covered in Episode 0, and also that you have some sort of working CRUD application or something that implements at least some of the 7 RESTful actions, because we're going to be taking a working application and adding on AJAX to it. We won't be starting from scratch. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. One of the first things that we need to decide when we're dealing with AJAX is what kind of data are we going to return? And we're going to start with the show action, so we need to know what kind of representation we're going to use for a contact. And what we're going to start with is an HTML representation, and that means we have to choose what is our minimum representation of a contact that we want to return. Now this is an arbitrary decision, so you can choose just to return an ID and a name or all of the details in different kind of formats. What I'm going to choose is this div here that says contact details. This is my minimum representation of a contact in HTML. And so for the view part of our model view controller, what I'm going to do is extract this bit into a partial. So we'll create a new partial in our contact subfolder called _contact.erb. And then that is going to hold our minimum representation of the HTML for a contact. And since I've done that, in order to keep our code dry, we will leverage that partial here by calling erb inside of here. And we say contacts /_contact.erb, and we have to give this an option called layout false. And the reason that we have to do that is essentially the layout is already being rendered for the show ERB, and we don't want to re-render that layout when we call this partial called contact. So that's what the layout false option is all about. And now we have a self-contained file that has just our minimum representation of the contact details. So we can use this view, we can continue to use this view how we did before. It's just been split up into 2 files. And then when we move to the controller action next, we'll be able to leverage this partial. Now that we have the view taken care of, we can move on to the controller here. And we're going to start with the show action, and we're just going to walk through really quick. Now, no matter if we're doing an AJAX request or a regular request, for the show action, we have to find a contact. There's no condition that we won't find a contact, so we leave that line exactly the same. What will change based on a new condition is whether or not we render the entire show page or something different. And the condition that we check is if the request is XHR. And if you remember from the concepts video, XHR stands for XML HTTP request. This is the indication that it's AJAX. I don't know why there's so many different acronyms, but this is what we use. And since Sinatra is a rack-based app, we have this request object with this XHR question mark method that makes it easy in our controller to make this determination. So if that's true, we want to do the AJAX thing, and I'll come back and fill this in. And now this part's important because we want to remain backwards compatible for people that aren't going to use AJAX. So unless this very particular thing is true, we're going to continue to do exactly what the application was doing before. This is very important for backwards compatibility. But if we do have this one very specific condition that the request is an XHR request, then what's going to change isn't much. We're still going to render text as HTML, but what we're going to do instead of the entire show page is we're going to render that contact page that we just showed you, and we're going to do it without the layout. So what this is going to do different is this entire layout file will no longer be rendered. So we're cutting out a lot of bytes, a lot of text here that's going to be unnecessary for our XHR request. We're not cutting out much here as far as byte size, but it's something that our front-end developer will not have to deal with, because what they really want is the minimum representation of a contact, which is what we're providing to them here. So not a whole lot changes in the controller. You're just choosing a subset of HTML to send back to your caller, which is probably a JavaScript developer, but it could really be anything that can make an XHR request. And so what we're going to do now is actually use something besides JavaScript to send an XHR request. This is called the Advanced REST Client. It's available in Chrome. And essentially it lets you set a URL and then type in raw headers and send requests to different websites over the internet, including my local hosts where I have Sinatra running in the background here. And this is the line in the header that will send the XHR request or the AJAX request to indicate to the server that that's what we want. So just for comparison, I'm going to take this out the first time. And when I send the request, we're going to see that we get back the entire page, including the layout. So we have the doc type up here. We have all this other information. We have the H1 here, and then we have this bit. But this div is all we actually want when we make the XHR request. So we can put that back in the headers here, and then we'll send the same request. It still goes to the exact same address. We just have a different, an additional header in our request. And now our server makes the decision, okay, all they want is the minimum representation. They sent me an XHR request, so that's all that I'm going to send them back. And you'll see data type here. Notice that this is independent. The accept line saying what content you accept in a response is different and independent of saying whether or not it's an AJAX request. And here we're saying our priority is HTML, but we also accept JSON. I don't know how real world that is, but it's going to help us because we're going to implement JSON next. So the request object in Sinatra will also tell us what kind of content type the requester accepts. If we look at some of the Sinatra documentation that's available here at their website, we see that the request has a method called accept ? And then you can basically give it a content type here. And we're going to do that for the application JSON content type. So we're going to take exactly what will show up in the header here. And then we'll come back to our controller. And if the request is XHR, we're also going to see if they're going to accept the content type of JSON as a response. So we put that in here as a string. Now, if that's the case, we actually have a helper method that we can use on our contact object, where we can just say, take a representation of this and convert it to JSON. Now, a lot of times you won't have this kind of convenience, but luckily for us, with Active Record, we do. Now, again, for backwards compatibility, before we were returning HTML, and in any other condition, we still want to return HTML unless they accept application JSON. Now with this additional functionality supporting returning JSON data, we can come back here and you'll see that we do accept JSON data here. So if we send this request, it's still going to be the same contact, still the same URL. We're just going to get back a different format, right? This is the representation of a contact as JSON data instead of as text HTML. Now, we can take this off because we provided backwards compatibility. If we don't accept that and we send this request, it will still return to us the HTML that we saw before. And you see that here. So now to review, we'll go over and we'll use Git to see what we've done. So I'm going to add all of our changes and we'll take a look at the ones that have been made. You'll see first in the controller here, what used to just be a rendering of the show page. Now we're still doing that if nothing has changed. So we're backwards compatible. But if the request is XHR, meaning if it's an AJAX request, we check if they accept JSON. We're making that our priority, and that's an arbitrary choice. But we're saying if you accept JSON, that's what I'm going to send you. Otherwise, I'm going to send you this HTML that does not have the layout in it. So beyond that, we made a change by creating this view that has just the contact information, nothing extra. And in creating that partial, We left the H1 here, but we removed this, what would have become duplicated code, and we called ERB to make that happen. So in review, what we've done here is we haven't changed any of the core functionality of our contact application. We've just provided a way for our front-end developers to access a subset of the information via JSON or a subset of HTML. And that's going to let them create something like a single-page app or some functionality where the user doesn't have to jump from page to page. They'll just be able to insert the contact information where they find it necessary. And you can follow the same pattern that we used for the show action for all of the actions. You put an if statement to see if it's an XHR request. You do something slightly different if it is. Otherwise, you continue to render what was there before to support full HTTP requests. And on the next episode, we will actually implement the client side, so you'll see how you can use this different functionality to make a more robust application on the front end. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.